Power is an intoxicating drug when handed to the wrong person, blinding them to the reality of who they are dealing with. It takes exactly 3 minutes for an ordinary Tuesday morning to shatter a man's life. Not the life of the man in handcuffs, but the man holding the keys. When a badge becomes a shield for prejudice, the universe has a brutal way of balancing the scales. This is the story of a routine patrol that turned into a spectacular collision of arrogance and absolute authority. It is a masterclass in why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover happens to hold a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. The crisp November air bit through the fabric of Thomas Arrington's faded grey sweatshirt, but he didn't mind. At 58 years old, the Honorable Thomas C. Arrington, United States District Judge for the Eastern District, cherished these quiet, anonymous mornings. He held a steaming paper cup of black coffee from a local bakery, leaning casually against the wrought-iron fence of a sprawling colonial home on Elm Crest Drive. Brookville was one of those aggressively manicured, ultra-wealthy suburbs where the autumn leaves seemed to fall in perfectly choreographed patterns. Thomas wasn't a resident of this specific street, but he had a deeply personal reason for being there. The colonial house he was admiring, with its wraparound porch and fresh white trim, was currently in escrow. He was purchasing it as a surprise wedding gift for his daughter, Chloe, and her fiancé. He had gone for his usual 5-mile morning run, detoured into the neighborhood, and stopped simply to envision his future grandchildren running across the front lawn. He wore standard running gear, worn-out black sweatpants, the aforementioned vintage Yale track sweatshirt from his undergrad days, and a dark blue beanie pulled down over his graying hair to ward off the chill. To Thomas, it was a moment of profound paternal pride. To Officer Bradley Jenkins, rolling down Elm Crest Drive in his black and white cruiser, it was a target. Jenkins was 34, a physical bruiser with a tight buzz cut and a reputation in the precinct for being proactive, a polite, bureaucratic term for aggressive. Sitting shotgun was Officer Colin Hayes, a rookie barely 6 months out of the academy, who spent most of his shifts nervously trying to anticipate Jenkins's erratic moods. "Look at this guy," Jenkins muttered, tapping his thick fingers against the steering wheel. The cruiser slowed to a crawl, just standing there, casing the joint. Hayes blinked, looking over at the older black man sipping coffee. "He's just drinking coffee, Brad. Probably taking a breather from a run. Look at his shoes. Those are Brooks running sneakers." "You're naive, Hayes. That's how they do it," Jenkins sneered, his tone dripping with the kind of casual prejudice that had metastasized over years of unchecked authority. "They dress down, pretend to be jogging, figure out who leaves for work at what time. Nobody runs in this neighborhood unless they live here. And he doesn't live here." Before Hayes could protest further, Jenkins threw the cruiser into park, the tires scraping harshly against the pristine curb. The sudden, aggressive halt pulled Thomas from his daydream. He watched with calm, analytical eyes as the cruiser's door swung open and Jenkins stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on the heavy black utility belt at his waist. "Morning, officers," Thomas said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, accustomed to filling a courtroom and demanding absolute silence. Today, however, he kept his tone polite, conversational, and entirely unbothered. Jenkins didn't return the greeting. He marched up the sidewalk, closing the distance until he was invading Thomas's personal space, radiating hostility. Hayes trailed a few paces behind, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "What exactly are you doing here?" Jenkins demanded, his chin jutting out. "Just enjoying the morning," Thomas replied smoothly, taking another sip of his coffee. "It's a beautiful neighborhood." "I didn't ask for a real estate review," Jenkins snapped. "I asked what you are doing standing outside this property. We've had burglaries in this area." A blatant lie, Thomas knew. The Brookville police blotter, which he read occasionally, was notoriously devoid of property crimes. "You're loitering." "Loitering implies I am remaining in a public place with the intent to commit a crime, officer," Thomas said, a hint of his judicial precision leaking into his syntax. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk, drinking a coffee, halfway through a morning run. There is no law against standing still." Jenkins's eyes narrowed. The lack of fear, the articulate pushback, it infuriated him. In Jenkins's world, people were supposed to tremble, apologize, and defer. "I don't need a lecture on the law from you," Jenkins said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "I need your ID now." Thomas held the officer's gaze. He could have ended it right there. He could have pulled out his wallet, flashed his federal identification, and watched the color drain from Jenkins's face. But as a man who had spent 3 decades in the justice system, first as a civil rights attorney, then as a prosecutor, and finally as a judge, Thomas felt a cold, hard knot of principle tighten in his chest. How many young men who looked like him, who didn't have a badge or a law degree, had faced this exact officer on this exact street? "Under what suspicion?" Thomas asked quietly. "Terry versus Ohio requires reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime before you can demand identification. Simply standing on a sidewalk does not meet that threshold." Hayes swallowed hard, stepping forward slightly. "Brad, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Hayes," Jenkins barked, never taking his eyes off Thomas. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. "Oh, we got a street lawyer here, a real legal scholar. Let me explain how this works out here in the real world, counselor. You're in my jurisdiction. You're acting suspiciously. You give me your ID, or I take you in for obstruction and loitering. Your choice." The street was entirely quiet, save for the hum of the cruiser's engine and the distant sound of a leaf blower. Thomas slowly lowered his coffee cup. He calculated his next move with the same precision he used when drafting a complex summary judgment. "I am politely declining your request, officer," Thomas said. "I have broken no laws. I am not disturbing the peace. I will finish my coffee and resume my run. Have a good, safe shift." Thomas turned, intending to jog down the pavement. It was a test, a clear boundary set by a citizen exercising his constitutional rights. Jenkins failed the test spectacularly. "Hey, I didn't say you were dismissed," Jenkins roared. He lunged forward, his heavy hand clamping down on Thomas's shoulder with enough force to bruise. The sudden violence caused Thomas to drop his coffee cup. It hit the pavement, the dark liquid splashing across his white sneakers. Thomas stiffened, his muscles tensing. "Remove your hand from me," he commanded. The tone was no longer conversational. It was the voice of a man who held the power to sentence men to life in federal prison, a voice that brokered no disobedience. For a fraction of a second, Jenkins hesitated, unsettled by the sheer authority radiating from the man, but his ego, bloated and fragile, immediately overrode his instincts. He shoved Thomas roughly against the wrought-iron fence. "You're detained!" Jenkins yelled, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. "Resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and failure to identify. Put your hands behind your back." "Brad, Jesus, stop!" Officer Hayes finally intervened, rushing forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "He wasn't resisting. He was just walking away. He's refusing a lawful order." Jenkins shoved his partner back with his free hand while pressing his forearm into Thomas's back. "Cuff him, Hayes. Now. That's a direct order." Thomas didn't struggle. He knew the lethal danger of physically fighting a police officer on a deserted street. He allowed his hands to be pulled behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into his wrists. Jenkins ratcheted them far tighter than necessary, a petty and vindictive maneuver meant to inflict pain. Click, click, click. The sound echoed loudly in the crisp morning air. Thomas looked over his shoulder at Jenkins, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. "You are making a profound mistake, officer." Yeah, save it for the judge," Jenkins mocked, grabbing Thomas by the bicep and dragging him toward the cruiser. "I intend to," Thomas replied softly. Jenkins patted him down forcefully, pulling Thomas's wallet from the sweatpants pocket. Jenkins didn't open it. He simply tossed it onto the dashboard of the cruiser through the open window, eager to assert his physical dominance. He placed a hand on top of Thomas's head and shoved him roughly into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the squad car. The door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud. In the front seat, Jenkins let out a breath, a victorious smirk on his face as he adjusted his duty belt. He looked over at Hayes, who was staring at the dashboard, pale and visibly shaking. "That's how you handle them, rookie," Jenkins said, putting the car in gear. "You give them an inch, they walk all over you." He thought he could quote some Supreme Court case, and I'd just tuck my tail and run? Not in my town. Hayes looked at the wallet resting on the dashboard. It was a high-end, worn leather billfold. "Brad, we didn't even check his ID. We don't know who he is. We didn't have PC to lock him up." "Probable cause is whatever I write in the report, Colin," Jenkins said dismissively, turning the steering wheel sharply. "He was uncooperative, belligerent, and exhibited pre-attack indicators. It's a clean collar. A few hours in a holding cell will teach him some manners." In the back seat, separated by the thick plexiglass partition, Thomas sat in silence. The awkward angle of his bound hands sent shooting pain up his shoulders, but his mind was racing, cataloguing every infraction, every policy violation, and every constitutional breach Jenkins had just committed. He looked out the window as the beautiful, tree-lined streets of Brookville rolled past, replaced slowly by the concrete and glass of the downtown commercial district. He thought about his daughter's wedding. He thought about the gavel sitting on his mahogany desk in his chambers. And he thought about the immense, crushing weight of the justice system that Jenkins so casually manipulated. "You wanted to play the system, Officer Jenkins," Thomas thought, his eyes fixed on the back of Jenkins's thick neck. "Let's see how you handle it when the system plays back." The drive to the 4th Precinct took exactly 14 minutes. For Officer Jenkins, it was 14 minutes of self-congratulatory monologuing. He turned the radio volume down to ensure his captive audience in the back seat could hear every word through the partition's speaker grate. "You know your problem?" Jenkins called back, adjusting his rearview mirror to make eye contact with Thomas. "You people always think you're above the law. You watch a couple of YouTube videos, read a Wikipedia page about your rights, and suddenly you think you can disrespect the badge. It's an epidemic." Thomas remained completely silent. He stared back into the mirror, his expression entirely neutral. His silence seemed to agitate Jenkins further. "Nothing to say now, huh? Where's all that big talk about Terry versus Ohio? Real quiet when the bracelets go on." Jenkins laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're lucky it's me. You pull this stunt in another precinct, you might not just be taking a ride. You ought to be thanking me for the reality check." Beside him, Hayes looked like he was going to be sick. The young officer kept glancing back at Thomas, searching for the typical signs of a career criminal. Panic, anger, desperation. Instead, he saw a man who looked like he was patiently waiting for a delayed flight. It unnerved Hayes deeply. The man wasn't scared. He was calculating. "Brad, look!" Hayes tried one last time, keeping his voice low. "Let's just pull over, write him a warning, and cut him loose." We don't need the paperwork for a loitering charge. The desk sergeant is going to rip us apart for bringing in a soft collar like this on a Tuesday morning." Jenkins slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "Are you deaf, Hayes? We are taking him in. I'm going to strip search him, book him, and let him sit in holding until he begs to make a phone call. You want to be a cop, you need to grow a spine." The cruiser pulled into the secure rear lot of the 4th Precinct, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The heavy steel garage doors rolled up, swallowing the car into the concrete belly of the station. Jenkins parked, killed the engine, and stepped out, aggressively swinging the back door open. "End of the line, Counselor. Let's go." He grabbed Thomas by the elbow, yanking him out of the car. Thomas stumbled slightly, his balance compromised by his constrained arms, but quickly righted himself, drawing himself up to his full 6'2" height. He towered over the stocky Jenkins, staring down at him, with a gaze so cold it made the officer instinctively take a half-step back. "Keep moving," Jenkins barked, quickly recovering his bravado, shoving Thomas toward the heavy steel doors leading to the intake area. They walked down a bleak, fluorescent-lit hallway, smelling of industrial bleach and old sweat. They turned a corner and entered the booking room. Behind a raised counter sat Desk Sergeant William O'Malley, a 20-year veteran with a graying mustache and a permanent scowl. O'Malley was currently typing away at a computer, surrounded by stacks of files. "What do we have, Jenkins?" O'Malley asked, without looking up. "Got a wise guy from Elmcrest Drive, Sarge," Jenkins announced loudly, parading Thomas up to the desk like a trophy. "Suspicious behavior, loitering, resisting arrest, refusing to IID, a real sovereign citizen type." O'Malley sighed, hitting the enter key with a loud clack before finally looking up. His eyes drifted over Jenkins, past a miserable-looking Hayes, and finally landed on the man in the handcuffs. O'Malley stopped breathing. The pen he was holding slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. The blood drained from the sergeant's face so rapidly he looked as though he might pass out. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back, his eyes wide and fixed on Thomas. "Jenkins," O'Malley whispered, his voice trembling. "I know, right?" Jenkins smirked, oblivious to the sergeant's terror. "Dressed like a bum, casing the rich houses. I tossed his wallet on the counter over there. Haven't even looked at it yet. I figure we put him in cell 3, let him cool off while I write up the narrative." O'Malley didn't look at the wallet. He looked at the handcuffs cutting into the man's wrists. He recognized Thomas immediately. Just 3 months prior, O'Malley had been the lead testifying officer in a massive federal racketeering case involving a local syndicate. He had spent 2 weeks in a federal courtroom, staring up at the raised dais, addressing the very man currently bleeding onto his precinct floor. "Jenkins, take those cuffs off," O'Malley said. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a tight, desperate command. "What?" "Sarge, he's a combative suspect. I need to—" "I said take the goddamn cuffs off him right now," O'Malley roared, the sound echoing violently off the concrete walls. Several other officers in the bullpen stopped what they were doing, heads snapping toward the booking desk. Jenkins froze, utterly bewildered. He fumbled for his keys, stepping behind Thomas. His hands were suddenly shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. Thomas brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as blood circulation returned to his hands. Deep red, angry welts encircled his wrists. He rubbed them silently, keeping his eyes locked on O'Malley. "Your Honor," O'Malley choked out, walking around the desk, his hands raised in a gesture of pure, unadulterated panic. "Judge Arrington." "Sir, I don't—" The booking room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Jenkins stopped breathing. He looked from O'Malley to the man in the faded Yale sweatshirt, his brain violently rejecting the words that had just been spoken. "Your Honor." Judge Arrington. Thomas slowly reached out to the booking counter, picking up his leather wallet that Jenkins had tossed there earlier. He opened it, pulling out a solid brass badge and an identification card bearing the seal of the United States Federal Courts. He placed it gently on the counter. He didn't look at O'Malley. He turned his head slowly, locking his eyes onto a pale, hyperventilating Officer Jenkins. "Now," Judge Thomas Arrington said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Let's talk about the narrative you're going to write. Here are the next 2 chapters of the story, focusing on the immediate fallout in the precinct and the crushing weight of the legal machinery turning against the officer. The silence in the 4th Precinct booking room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the air out of Officer Bradley Jenkins's lungs. He stared at the small, solid brass shield resting on the scuffed surface of the booking counter. It was not a local police badge. It bore the majestic, terrifying seal of the United States Courts. "Judge Arrington," Desk Sergeant O'Malley repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the angry purple indentations circling the judge's wrists. Assaulting a federal judge was a felony that carried decades in prison. False arrest of a federal judge under color of law was a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Jenkins's mind violently misfired, desperately trying to construct a reality where this wasn't happening. "Wait," Jenkins stammered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of the booming authority he had wielded minutes prior. "Sarge, this has to be a mistake. He was pacing outside a house on Elmcrest. He refused to identify himself." Judge Thomas Arrington finally shifted his gaze from O'Malley to Jenkins. The look in his eyes was not furious. It was clinical, dissecting, and utterly devoid of pity. "I did not pace, Officer Jenkins. I stood," Thomas said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man delivering a sentence. "I did not refuse to identify myself. I rightfully declined an unlawful demand for identification under the 4th Amendment, as you lacked reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime. Your response to my exercise of constitutional rights was physical battery, unlawful detainment, and kidnapping under the guise of police authority." Jenkins swallowed hard, taking a step back. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal terror. "Kidnapping? Your Honor, please, I was just doing my job. We've had a rash of—" "Do not insult my intelligence by repeating the lie about burglaries in Brookville," Thomas interrupted, his tone slicing through Jenkins's defense like a scalpel. "I read the municipal crime statistics. Brookville has not had a reported residential burglary in 14 months. You saw a black man in a sweatshirt in an affluent neighborhood, and you made an assumption. When I did not cower, your ego mandated violence." Jenkins looked to his partner, desperate for a lifeline. "Colin, tell them. Tell them he was acting suspicious." Officer Colin Hayes stood frozen by the doorway, his face pale. He looked at Jenkins, then at the judge. The young rookie realized in that exact moment that his career, barely 6 months old, was hanging by a thread over an abyss. "Brad," Hayes whispered, his voice trembling, "I told you to stop. I told you we didn't have probable cause. I told you he wasn't resisting." Jenkins's jaw dropped. Betrayal flashed across his face, but it was quickly swallowed by the horrifying realization that his own partner had just established the prosecution's timeline. "Sergeant O'Malley," Thomas said, turning his attention back to the desk, "I want you to secure the dashcam and bodycam footage from Officer Jenkins's vehicle immediately. Do not let him near the servers. Secondly, you will contact Chief David Harrison. You will tell him to get down here right now. Finally, you will contact Special Agent Richard Caldwell at the local FBI field office." O'Malley blinked, his hands hovering over his keyboard. The FBI, Your Honor." "Yes, Sergeant," Thomas replied calmly, rubbing his bruised wrists. "Because what happened today is not a local administrative matter. It is a federal civil rights violation under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Make the calls." Jenkins felt his knees go weak. The room began to spin slightly. He reached out to steady himself against a metal filing cabinet. "Your Honor, please," Jenkins begged, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I have a family. I have a pension. If you ruin my career over a misunderstanding, I'll apologize. I'll write a formal apology. Just, please don't do this." Thomas stepped closer to Jenkins, invading the officer's space just as Jenkins had done to him on the sidewalk. But Thomas did not use his hands. He used the sheer, crushing weight of his presence. "A misunderstanding is forgetting to signal a lane change, Mr. Jenkins," Thomas said quietly. "What you did was a deliberate abuse of state power. You are apologizing now only because you discovered the man you assaulted has the power to destroy you. If I were a plumber, or a teacher, or a construction worker, I would currently be sitting in a holding cell, facing fabricated charges of resisting arrest, desperate to make bail." Thomas leaned in closer. "The law does not exist solely to protect the powerful, Mr. Jenkins. It exists to protect the vulnerable from men exactly like you. You will face the full consequence of your actions. Now, step away from me." By 10 a.m., the 4th precinct resembled a disturbed anthill. Chief David Harrison, a man who had spent 30 years building a pristine political reputation, arrived in a state of barely concealed panic, still wearing his civilian suit jacket over a golf shirt. He had practically sprinted through the back doors. Following closely behind him were 2 stone-faced agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, carrying briefcases and a mandate from the Department of Justice. Judge Arrington was sitting quietly in the chief's private office, sipping a fresh cup of coffee the precinct secretary had nervously provided. He was fully composed, his demeanor identical to the one he maintained on the bench. In a stark, windowless interrogation room down the hall, Bradley Jenkins sat alone. His badge and service weapon had been stripped from him. He was no longer Officer Jenkins. He was the subject of a federal criminal investigation. His police union representative, a notoriously aggressive lawyer named Peter Dawson, had arrived an hour earlier, looking incredibly grim. "How bad is it, Pete?" Jenkins asked, his voice hoarse. He had been staring at the scuffed linoleum floor for an hour. Dawson sighed, dropping a thick legal pad onto the metal table. "Brad, I'm going to level with you. You didn't just step in it. You dove headfirst into a wood chipper. We pulled the dashcam audio from the cruiser. We have you on tape mocking him, ignoring his invocation of Terry versus Ohio, and explicitly stating to Officer Hayes that probable cause is whatever I write in the report." Jenkins buried his face in his hands. "I was just blowing off steam. Cops talk like that." "Cops don't say that on a hot mic while illegally detaining a sitting federal judge," Dawson snapped, losing his patience. "You bruised his wrists, Brad. You committed a battery. The FBI is taking over the investigation because the DOJ considers this a textbook civil rights violation. They are going to make an example out of you." "But Hayes," Jenkins looked up, grasping at straws. "Hayes didn't stop me. He's complicit." "Hayes has already given a sworn statement to Internal Affairs and the FBI," Dawson said flatly. "He corroborated everything the judge said. He testified that you acted with malice, that the judge was entirely compliant, and that you fabricated the narrative. In exchange, the feds are treating him as a cooperating witness instead of a co-conspirator. You are completely alone on an island." Meanwhile, in the chief's office, the atmosphere was painfully deferential. Chief Harrison sat awkwardly across from Thomas, while the two FBI agents set up a digital recorder. "Judge Arrington, on behalf of the entire department, I cannot express how deeply ashamed I am," Chief Harrison began, his hands clasped tightly together. "Jenkins is an outlier. We are suspending him immediately without pay, pending termination. We can handle this internally, swiftly and quietly." "Chief Harrison," Thomas said, setting his coffee cup down, "do not attempt to placate me with the few bad apples rhetoric." Officer Jenkins felt entirely comfortable executing an unlawful arrest, manufacturing charges, and boasting about falsifying police reports in front of a junior officer. That is not the behavior of an outlier. That is the behavior of a man who operates within a culture of absolute impunity. Thomas looked at the FBI agents. "I am pressing full federal charges. Furthermore, I will be forwarding a formal recommendation to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to open a pattern or practice investigation into the 4th Precinct." If Jenkins was willing to do this to a man quoting case law at him in Brookville, I shudder to think what he has done to individuals who did not know their rights. Chief Harrison visibly deflated, the color draining from his face. A DOJ probe could dismantle his department, end his career, and cost the city millions in oversight. Your Honor, a federal probe, that takes years. It will tear the department apart. If your department is harboring officers who weaponize the law, Chief, then it needs to be torn apart and rebuilt, Thomas replied. He stood up, smoothing the front of his Yale sweatshirt. I will be leaving now. I expect a copy of the finalized indictment on my desk by the end of the month. As Thomas walked out of the chief's office, he passed the booking area. Jenkins was being led out of the interrogation room by his union lawyer, heading toward the back exit to avoid the local press that had somehow already gotten wind of the incident and were gathering out front. Jenkins stopped as he saw the judge. The aggressive, bullying cop from Elmcrest Drive was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man whose entire life had just been dismantled in less than 3 hours. Jenkins opened his mouth, perhaps to offer one final, desperate apology. Thomas didn't break stride. He didn't even look at Jenkins. He walked straight past him, out the heavy glass doors of the precinct, and stepped into the crisp autumn sunlight, leaving the machinery of justice to grind the man who had abused it into dust. 14 months later, the crisp autumn air had returned to the city, but Bradley Jenkins was no longer enjoying the view from the front seat of a police cruiser. He sat at the defense table in courtroom 4B of the United States District Court, wearing an ill-fitting grey suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. The past year had stripped away his swagger, his badge, and his pension. The local police union had quietly distanced itself from him the moment the Department of Justice, acting under the authority of the Civil Rights Division, led by Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, announced a formal pattern or practice investigation into the 4th Precinct. Now Jenkins was fighting for his freedom. He was charged with a felony violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Across the aisle sat U.S. Attorney Sarah Kensington, a relentless prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and zero-tolerance policy for police misconduct. She did not look at Jenkins with anger. She looked at him as a mathematician looks at a solved equation. The gallery behind them was packed with local journalists, civil rights advocates, and several off-duty officers who had come to watch the spectacular fall of one of their own. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Robert T. Callahan, a senior judge brought in from a neighboring federal district to ensure absolute impartiality. The trial had been a brutal, methodical dismantling of Jenkins's defense. His attorney, Peter Dawson, had attempted to argue that Jenkins had made an honest mistake in a high-stress environment, trying to paint Thomas Arrington as an uncooperative citizen who escalated the situation. It was a flimsy shield, and Kensington shattered it completely on the third day of the trial. The defense claims Officer Jenkins was acting on a reasonable suspicion of burglary, Kensington told the jury, her voice ringing clear across the mahogany-paneled room. Let's hear exactly what Officer Jenkins considered reasonable. Kensington played the audio from the cruiser's dash cam. The courtroom sat in dead silence as Jenkins's recorded voice echoed off the walls, dripping with arrogant disdain. Probable cause is whatever I write in the report, Colin. Jenkins closed his eyes, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. The prosecution's star witness was none other than former Officer Colin Hayes. Hayes had resigned from the force shortly after the incident, unable to stomach the internal politics. Taking the stand in a neat civilian suit, Hayes was visibly nervous but resolute. Did Judge Arrington ever make a threatening movement toward Officer Jenkins? Kensington asked, pacing slowly before the jury box. No, ma'am, Hayes replied, his voice shaking slightly. He was entirely calm. He explicitly cited Terry versus Ohio, explaining that we lacked the suspicion required to demand his ID. He turned to walk away, which was his legal right. That's when Brad, Officer Jenkins, grabbed him and shoved him against the fence. Did you attempt to intervene, Mr. Hayes? I did. Hayes swallowed hard. I told him to stop. I told him we didn't have PC. He told me it was a direct order to cuff him and that I needed to grow a spine. The fatal blow, however, came on the afternoon of the fourth day. Judge Thomas Arrington took the stand. He did not wear his judicial robes. He wore a tailored navy suit. He did not look like an angry victim. He radiated the profound, unshakable authority of a man who understood the law down to its very bedrock. Dawson, sweating profusely, attempted to cross-examine him. Judge Arrington, isn't it true that by simply handing over your ID, this entire situation could have been avoided? Weren't you, in a way, baiting my client to prove a point? Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Dawson with the same piercing intensity he used from the bench. Mr. Dawson, the United States Constitution is not a courtesy we extend to law enforcement when it is convenient. It is an absolute boundary. I was not baiting your client. I was existing in a public space. If I surrender my Fourth Amendment rights simply because an officer with a bruised ego demands it, I am failing my oath to uphold the law. I didn't escalate the situation. Your client manufactured a crime to justify his violence. Dawson had no further questions. The courtroom was utterly silent. But the hardest twist of karma was yet to be revealed. During the DOJ's investigation into Jenkins, they had unsealed his disciplinary file, a file Chief David Harrison had previously kept buried. Kensington introduced it during her closing arguments. Jenkins had 6 prior excessive force complaints, all involving minority men in affluent neighborhoods. All 6 had been dismissed internally. Thomas Arrington was not an anomaly, Kensington told the jury, pointing a sharp finger at Jenkins. He was simply the first victim who had the power to fight back. The defendant used his badge as a weapon. It is time for the law he abused to hold him accountable. The waiting is always what breaks a man. For 14 hours across 2 agonizing days of deliberation, Bradley Jenkins sat in the cold, cavernous expanse of courtroom 4B, staring at the polished mahogany grain of the defense table until it blurred. The bravado that had defined his entire adult life, the swaggering, unassailable confidence of a man who wore a badge and a gun, had been meticulously stripped away, layer by layer, over the course of the 2-week trial. He was no longer a predator. He was prey caught in the inescapable, grinding gears of the federal justice system. Beside him, his union-appointed attorney, Peter Dawson, sat in stoic silence, occasionally scribbling meaningless notes on a legal pad. Dawson had stopped offering false hope 48 hours ago, when U.S. Attorney Sarah Kensington had played the dashcam audio for the jury, Jenkins's own voice, dripping with arrogant disdain, boasting that probable cause is whatever I write in the report. Dawson had visibly slumped. That audio was the sound of a coffin nailing itself shut. At exactly 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday, the sharp, jarring buzz of the intercom cut through the heavy silence of the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. A heavy, suffocating tension instantly filled the room. The gallery, packed shoulder to shoulder with local journalists, civil rights advocates, and tight-lipped off-duty police officers, leaned forward collectively. In the second row, sitting perfectly upright, was Judge Thomas Arrington. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit. His expression was a fortress of calm, his eyes fixed steadily on the empty jury box. He did not look angry. He looked like a man watching a mathematical equation resolve itself exactly as the formula dictated. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high acoustic ceilings. The Honourable Robert T. Callahan emerged from chambers, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat at the elevated dais. He was a stern, uncompromising jurist brought in from an adjacent federal district to ensure there could be no accusations of local bias. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at the defense table with an expression of profound, clinical detachment. "Bring in the jury," Judge Callahan ordered. Jenkins's heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mouth was entirely dry, tasting of stale coffee and copper panic. He watched the heavy wooden door on the side of the courtroom swing open. The 12 men and women filed in, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Jenkins searched their faces, desperate for a sign, a sympathetic glance, a hint of hesitation. He found nothing. Not a single juror would make eye contact with him. The foreperson, a retired middle school teacher with severe wire-rimmed glasses, clutched a folded piece of white paper tightly in her right hand. She stared straight ahead at the judge. Every defense attorney knows the universal tell. When the jury refuses to look at the defendant, the verdict is guilty. "Madam Foreperson," Judge Callahan said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the woman replied, her voice remarkably steady. "Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The piece of paper was transferred from the foreperson to the bailiff, who walked it up to the judge. Callahan unfolded it. He read it silently, his face betraying absolutely zero emotion. He nodded once, refolded the paper, and handed it back to the bailiff to return to the foreperson. The silence in the room was so absolute that the rustle of the paper sounded like a gunshot. "The defendant will please rise," Judge Callahan instructed. Dawson gripped Jenkins's elbow, physically hauling the former officer to his feet. Jenkins's knees felt like water. The courtroom seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. On the sole count of the federal indictment, the foreperson read, adjusting her glasses. "Deprivation of rights under color of law, in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, we find the defendant, Bradley Jenkins." She paused for a fraction of a second, taking a breath. "Guilty." A collective, shuddering gasp rippled through the gallery. Several reporters immediately bolted for the heavy double doors at the back of the room to file their breaking news alerts. Jenkins did not gasp. He simply stopped breathing entirely. The word struck him with the kinetic force of a freight train. Guilty. The ringing in his ears drowned out the subsequent murmurs in the courtroom. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white, desperate to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. He was a convicted federal felon. His pension was gone. His freedom was gone. His identity was gone. Judge Callahan banged his gavel, a sharp, authoritative crack that instantly silenced the gallery. Order in the court. The jury is thanked and dismissed. Because this was a high-profile federal case involving the severe abuse of public office, and because Jenkins had been out on bond during the trial, U.S. Attorney Kensington immediately stood up. Your Honor, in light of the verdict, the government requests that the defendant's bond be revoked and he be remanded immediately into federal custody pending sentencing. Dawson offered a weak token objection, citing Jenkins's lack of flight risk, but Callahan waved it away with a flick of his wrist. The objection is noted and overruled, Judge Callahan stated coldly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bench, and finally locked his eyes directly onto Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, Callahan began, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that commanded absolute attention. Law enforcement officers are entrusted with the most profound power a civilized society can bestow, the power to legally deprive another human being of their liberty and, if necessary, their life. It is a sacred trust. When you abuse that power, when you weaponize it to feed your own petty ego, to bully a citizen standing peacefully on a sidewalk, you do not merely harm an individual. You violently corrode the very foundation of public trust. Callahan picked up a thick manila file from his desk, Jenkins's unsealed internal affairs file, the one detailing 6 prior, buried complaints of excessive force. You treated the United States Constitution as an inconvenience, a nuisance that got in the way of your personal authority. You operated under the delusion that your badge was a license for tyranny. You were wrong. Today, the law you swore to uphold, the law you so casually mocked, has held you to account. Callahan looked to the back of the room. United States Marshals, take the defendant into custody. 2 deputy U.S. Marshals stepped forward from the shadows near the holding cell door. They did not swagger. They did not yell. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized, and absolute professionalism. They flanked Jenkins on either side. Hands behind your back, the taller marshal ordered, his tone flat and non-negotiable. Jenkins was trembling violently now. The tears he had fought back for 2 weeks finally breached his eyes, spilling down his pale cheeks. He turned slowly, surrendering his arms. He felt the cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs press against his wrists. Click, click, click. The ratcheting sound echoed off the wood paneling. It was the exact same, distinct, mechanical sound that had echoed on the quiet, leafy streets of Elmcrest Drive 14 months prior. But there was no vindictive squeezing this time, no unnecessary pain inflicted by the marshals. It was simply the cold, heavy, clinical application of the law. As Jenkins was turned toward the holding cell door, his eyes drifted to the gallery. He locked eyes with Thomas Arrington. Thomas was standing now, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not smile. He did not sneer. There was no gleam of triumph in his eyes. He merely looked at Jenkins with the solemn, unblinking gravity of a judge who had just witnessed the system correct a terrible error. In that brief, silent exchange, Jenkins finally understood the true weight of what he had done. He hadn't just picked the wrong target. He had exposed himself as a small, weak man, hiding behind state-sanctioned violence, and he had been broken by a man whose power came from an unshakable core of dignity and intellect. Jenkins broke eye contact, his head dropping to his chest in absolute defeat, and allowed himself to be led through the heavy steel door. The karmic shockwave of that Tuesday morning arrest did not stop with Bradley Jenkins's incarceration. When the hammer falls at the federal level, it shatters the ground beneath it. Within a month of the guilty verdict, the Department of Justice finalized its sweeping consent decree regarding the Brookville 4th Precinct. Chief David Harrison, facing the imminent exposure of years of covered-up misconduct, was forced to resign in public disgrace, forfeiting a significant portion of his lucrative pension. The precinct was placed under the control of an independent federal monitor. Dozens of officers who had thrived in the toxic culture Jenkins helped cultivate either resigned or were systematically terminated. As for Jenkins, his reality became a nightmare. Sentenced to 84 months, 7 full years, he was transferred to a federal correctional institution. As a former police officer, he was immediately placed in the Special Housing Unit, SHU, for his own protection. Hard karma is not swift, it is agonizingly slow. Jenkins spent 23 hours a day, locked in a concrete cell, no larger than a parking space, isolated, paranoid, and utterly alone, with nothing but the echoes of his own arrogance to keep him company. On a bright, crisp Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the trial concluded, the autumn air bit sharply against the fallen leaves in the ultra-wealthy suburb of Brookville. Thomas Arrington found himself standing on the pavement of Elmcrest Drive once again. He was not wearing his faded Yale sweatshirt today, though he still owned it. He wore a heavy, dark wool peacoat against the morning chill. He stood on the sidewalk, looking past the wrought-iron fence at the sprawling colonial home with the pristine white trim and the wide wraparound porch. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb, and 2 people stepped out. His daughter, Chloe, her face radiant with a bright, wide smile, ran up the sidewalk, followed closely by her new husband, David. "Dad!" Chloe called out, throwing her arms around Thomas's neck in a fierce, tight embrace. "We're here. I can't believe we're actually here." "Welcome home, sweetheart," Thomas said, his deep baritone voice thick with emotion, as he hugged her back, patting David warmly on the shoulder as the young man approached. Thomas reached into the deep pocket of his wool coat and pulled out a heavy brass key ring. He placed it gently into Chloe's open palm, closing her fingers over it. "It's officially yours," Thomas said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The paperwork cleared yesterday. It's ready for you." Chloe looked down at the keys, wiping a happy tear from her cheek. "It's too much, Dad. It's so beautiful. I can already see the kids running around in that front yard." "That is exactly what I saw the first time I stood on this sidewalk," Thomas replied softly, his gaze drifting over the manicured lawn. David looked around the quiet, peaceful street, listening to the distant rustle of the wind through the massive oak trees. "It's so quiet here. Seems like a perfectly safe place to put down roots." "It is," Thomas nodded, a profound sense of peace settling over him. "It is now." He looked down the street, remembering the flashing red and blue lights, the rough shove against the iron fence, the cold steel biting into his wrists. The memory was sharp, but it no longer carried any sting. The system, for all its flaws, its blind spots, and its vulnerabilities to corrupt men, had held the line. He had stood his ground, armed with nothing but the law, and the law had shielded him. "Come on." Chloe tugged at his sleeve, her laughter bright and melodic. "Let's go inside. I want to figure out where we're putting the dining room table." "Lead the way." Thomas smiled. As he walked up the paved driveway, leaving the public sidewalk behind, Thomas Arrington didn't look back. The universe had balanced its scales. The shadows of arrogance had been burned away by the harsh light of justice, and a new chapter was waiting on the other side of the front door. The story of Officer Jenkins and Judge Arrington serves as a stark, dramatic reminder that absolute power corrupts absolutely. until it collides with an immovable force. It illustrates the dangerous fragility of an ego shielded by a badge and the profound necessity of constitutional boundaries. Jenkins assumed his authority was unquestionable, relying on a system that historically protected his prejudices. However, true justice is blind to a uniform, just as it should be blind to the clothes a man wears on his morning run. The karma that dismantled Jenkins's life was not a supernatural force. It was the meticulous, unyielding application of the very law he swore to uphold, but chose to ignore. Ultimately, accountability is the only true antidote to arrogance, proving that no one, no matter their title, weapon, or perceived dominance, is above the consequences of their actions.